The bitter scent of industrial bleach and scorched coffee always clung to Sophie's skin, no matter how hard she scrubbed. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of wet, bone-chilling November night that made the neon signs outside the diner bleed red and blue across the rain-slicked pavement. Sophie leaned over the Formica counter, her rag moving in slow, rhythmic circles over a sticky syrup stain. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, familiar ache that had become her constant companion over the last 5 years. "You missed a spot." The voice belonged to a man in a tailored wool overcoat, his silver watch catching the harsh fluorescent light as he pointed a manicured finger at the corner of the booth. He hadn't looked at Sophie's face once during the 45 minutes he'd sat there nursing a black coffee. To him, she wasn't a person. She was a uniform, an appliance. "I'm sorry, sir," Sophie murmured, her voice stripped of whatever pride she had left. She wiped the corner, her knuckles white, her hands raw and cracked from the cold and the chemicals. The man dropped a single crumpled dollar bill onto the wet table. It soaked up the leftover moisture instantly. "Keep the change." Sophie watched him walk out, the bell above the door chiming a hollow goodbye. She pocketed the damp dollar. It was exactly enough to buy 1 carton of generic milk for her son, Leo. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the exhaustion wash over her, heavy as an iron blanket. 7 years old, with eyes too big for his face and a quiet understanding of the world that broke Sophie's heart daily. Leo shouldn't have to understand why the heat was turned down to 50 degrees in their apartment. He shouldn't have to understand why dinner was sometimes just buttered toast. But he did. When Sophie finally trudged up the 3 flights of stairs to their cramped apartment, the cold seemed to follow her inside. The radiator in the corner was silent, its pipes freezing to the touch. She found Leo asleep on the worn sofa, wrapped in 3 blankets, his small chest rising and falling softly. On the coffee table next to him sat a stack of past-due bills, their red font glowing like warning beacons in the dim light. And right in the center of the pile was an envelope that didn't belong. It was thick, creamy parchment, heavy in her tired hands. The return address was stamped in an elegant, embossed font: Sterling, Hayes and Vance, Estate Law, Orono, Maine. Sophie frowned, rubbing her thumb over the raised lettering. She didn't know anyone in Maine. She barely knew anyone outside of her immediate zip code. With trembling, paper-cut fingers, she broke the seal. The letter inside was concise, drafted with the cold precision of legal machinery, but the words on the page made the breath catch in Sophie's throat. Pertaining to the final will and testament of Arthur Pendleton, your maternal great-uncle. You have been named the sole beneficiary of his estate, comprising a parcel of land and the primary residence located at 44 Blackwood Ridge, Blackwood County, Maine. Sophie sank onto the edge of the sofa, the floorboards croaking beneath her weight. A house, a whole house, and land. The memory of Uncle Arthur was incredibly faint. A tall, quiet man with calloused hands who smelled of pine needles and peppermint. A man who had vanished from family gatherings before Sophie had even learned to ride a bike. There had always been whispers about him, rumors that he was a hoarder, a hermit, a paranoid man who had retreated to the frozen north to escape the modern world. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the word estate. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar thing, began to bloom in Sophie's chest. A property in Maine. Even if she just sold it, it could be enough. Enough to pay off the crushing medical debt from Leo's early years. Enough to move out of this freezing, mold-lined apartment. Enough to never have to wipe a syrupy table for a sneering man in a wool coat ever again. For the first time in 5 years, Sophie went to sleep with a smile on her face, dreaming of warm fires and a home of her own. 3 weeks later, that dream shattered into a million jagged pieces. The drive north had drained the last of her meager savings. She had packed everything they owned into her sputtering, 15-year-old sedan, wrapped Leo in his thickest coat, and driven straight into the teeth of an early Maine winter. The roads had grown narrower, the snowbanks higher, until the GPS lost its signal completely, leaving them navigating by a hand-drawn map provided by the lawyer. When they finally turned onto the deeply rutted, unplowed dirt road of Blackwood Ridge, the temperature outside was -12 degrees. The trees here didn't look alive. They were skeletal, towering pines choked with ice, their branches twisting together like interlaced fingers blocking out the pale winter sun. "Is this it, Mom?" Leo asked, his breath misting the cold glass of the passenger window. Sophie stopped the car. She stared through the windshield, her heart plummeting into her stomach. It wasn't a house. It was a corpse of a building. Sitting in a clearing of waist-deep snow was a decaying, lopsided cabin. The roof had partially caved in on the left side, the shingles stripped away by years of violent blizzards. The front porch was sagging, the wood black with rot. The windows were either shattered or boarded up with decaying plywood. There was no chimney smoke, no power lines, just an oppressive, suffocating silence. Waiting by a high-end, heated SUV near the property line was a man in a heavy parka. He was the local attorney, Mr. Hayes, who had offered to meet them and hand over the keys. Sophie stepped out of the car, the biting wind instantly cutting through her thin winter coat. Hayes didn't smile as she approached. He looked at her car, then at her frayed boots, and let out a quiet sigh that spoke volumes. "I tried to warn you on the phone, Miss Pendleton," Hayes said, handing her a heavy, rusted iron key. "The property has been abandoned for 15 years. Arthur passed away a long time ago, and the county only just tracked down the title. It's uninhabitable." "But the land," Sophie stammered, her voice shaking from the cold and the shock. "The land must be worth something. We can sell it." Hayes shook his head, looking away. "The soil is dead. It's mostly rock and frozen clay. And worse, Arthur stopped paying property taxes 20 years ago. There's a lien on the deed for $42,000. If you claim the property, you inherit the debt. If you don't, the county seizes it on Monday." Sophie felt the world tilt on its axis. $42,000. It might as well have been $42 million. The hope that had sustained her for 3 weeks evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching despair. She had quit her job. She had given up her apartment. She had spent her last $300 on gas and food to get here. She was completely, utterly trapped. "I'm sorry," Hayes said, though he didn't sound particularly moved. He had seen this before. "My advice: walk away. Let the county have it. Cut your losses." He got into his warm SUV and drove away, leaving Sophie standing in the freezing snow, staring at a rotting house that was worth less than nothing. She couldn't afford a motel. They had nowhere else to go. Tonight, they would have to sleep inside the ruin. Sophie carried Leo inside, stepping carefully over the rotting floorboards. The interior was a frozen tomb. The air tasted of dust, mildew, and ancient cold. Furniture was overturned, covered in decades of grime. She found a small corner in what used to be a living room, furthest from the collapsed roof, and set up their sleeping bags. She wrapped Leo in every blanket they owned, feeding him cold canned soup by the light of a single flashlight. "It's like an adventure, right, Mom?" Leo whispered, his teeth chattering slightly. Sophie forced a smile, fighting back tears. "Just an adventure, baby. Go to sleep. I'll figure it out tomorrow." But as the hours crept by and the temperature dropped even further, Sophie couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, tearing at the loose boards, making the whole cabin groan and sway. It sounded like the forest itself was trying to break in. Around 2 a.m., the wind died down for a brief, eerie moment. And in that heavy silence, Sophie heard it. Clink. She froze, her breath pluming in the darkness. She strained her ears. Clink, clink. It was a faint, metallic sound. Rhythmic, deliberate. And it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from beneath her. Sophie slowly unzipped her sleeping bag, shivering violently as the freezing air hit her. She grabbed the flashlight, its yellow beam trembling in her hand. She followed the sound. It seemed to be coming from the center of the room, beneath a massive, moldering Persian rug that was stiff with ice and dirt. Clink. Sophie knelt beside the rug. It was heavy, practically frozen to the floorboards. Gritting her teeth, Sophie dug her raw fingers under the edge and pulled with all her meager strength. Dust billowed into the air, choking her, but the rug tore free with a sickening ripping sound. Beneath it was not solid wood. There, perfectly flush with the rotting floorboards, was a square made of thick, reinforced steel. It was completely incongruous with the decaying cabin. It looked modern, industrial, and heavy. In the center of the steel plate was a recessed iron handle, and beside it, a heavy deadbolt. Sophie stared at it, her heart hammering against her ribs. Why would a hermit in a rotting wooden shack have a steel-reinforced hatch in his floor? She reached down and touched the metal. It wasn't freezing cold like the rest of the cabin. It was faintly, impossibly warm. Clink. The sound happened again, right beneath the steel. Sophie grabbed the iron handle. It was stiff with disuse, but as she put her entire body weight into it, pulling upward with a desperate grunt, the heavy deadbolt gave way with a loud, metallic clack. The steel hatch swung upward on massive, well-oiled hinges, revealing a square hole of pitch-black darkness. A rush of warm, dry air hit her face. It smelled sharply of ozone, machine oil, and old paper. She pointed the flashlight down. Instead of a dirt cellar, she saw a staircase. Not a wooden ladder, but a spiral staircase made of immaculate, diamond-tread steel, descending deep into the earth. It went down further than the beam of her flashlight could reach. Sophie looked back at Leo, who was still fast asleep in his cocoon of blankets. She knew she should wait for morning. She knew she shouldn't go down there alone. But the warmth rising from the darkness was intoxicating, and the mystery was too heavy to ignore. Sophie gripped the flashlight tight and took her first step down into the earth. The descent was longer than she anticipated. The air grew warmer with every step, and the sounds of the howling wind above faded into a profound, heavy silence. When her boots finally hit solid ground, she swept the flashlight around. She was standing in a long, concrete corridor. The walls were thick, poured concrete, smooth and completely dry. Above her, a series of fluorescent tube lights ran down the ceiling, dead and dark. This wasn't a root cellar. This was a bunker. At the end of the corridor was a heavy steel door, much like the ones on a bank vault, though smaller. It stood slightly ajar. Sophie approached it, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the quiet space. She pushed the heavy door open. The room beyond was an office, perfectly preserved in time. A heavy oak desk sat in the center, flanked by filing cabinets. On the desk was a vintage leather swivel chair, an old rotary telephone, and a green glass banker's lamp. But what caught Sophie's eye was the small, battery-operated metronome sitting on the edge of the desk. Clink, clink, clink. The metronome was ticking, slowly, weakly, but moving. The battery must have been failing for years, yet somehow, it was still swinging. Someone had left it on. Sophie walked over to the desk. There was no dust here. The air filtration system, wherever it was, must still be working. Sitting perfectly centered on the oak desk was a single leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The pages were filled with Uncle Arthur's cramped, precise handwriting. It wasn't a diary. It was a manifest. Rows and rows of numbers. Dates stretching back to the late 1960s. Next to the dates were strange codes and descriptions. 1969, Project Silver, acquired. 1972, Asset 44, stabilized. 1981, the Cobalt series, sealed. At the very bottom of the last page, written in red ink, was a final entry dated just days before Arthur's presumed death. The vault is sealed. The climate control holds. They will never find it here. If she comes, she will need the key. Sophie frowned. She? Did he mean her? Arthur had died when she was barely a teenager. Beneath the ledger was a small, heavy object wrapped in a velvet cloth. She unfolded it. It was a brass key, strangely shaped, with 4 distinct prongs. Before Sophie could examine it further, a sound made her freeze. It wasn't a clink. It was a loud, heavy thud. It came from above. From the cabin. Someone was walking across the floorboards. Sophie clicked off the flashlight instantly, plunging the underground office into total darkness. Her heart leaped into her throat, beating so hard it hurt. Leo was up there. She moved blindly, feeling her way out of the office and back toward the spiral staircase. She climbed as fast and as quietly as she could. As she neared the top, she could hear voices. Male voices. Told you it was empty, Vance. The lawyer said she couldn't pay the lien. I don't care what Hayes said, a deep, raspy voice replied. She was here. Look at the tire tracks. And look at this sleeping bag. Sophie's blood ran cold. She peeked over the edge of the hatch. Standing in the dim morning light, filtering through the broken windows, were 2 men. One was large, wearing a hunting jacket and carrying a heavy crowbar. The other man, clearly the one in charge, was sharply dressed despite the freezing weather, wearing a dark wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He had a sharp, predatory face, his eyes darting around the ruined room. This was Vance. The same Vance from the law firm's letterhead? Sterling, Hayes and Vance. "Wake the kid up," Vance said casually, gesturing to Leo. "Tell him his mother has visitors." "Don't touch him," Sophie screamed, hauling herself up through the hatch. The two men spun around. The large man gripped his crowbar, but Vance simply raised an eyebrow, looking down at the steel trapdoor Sophie had emerged from. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. Well, Vance purred, his eyes gleaming. "The legendary basement. I always knew the old crazy bastard was hiding something under this rot." Sophie slammed the heavy steel hatch shut behind her and stepped between the men and her sleeping son. Leo was awake now, peering terrified from beneath his blankets. "Who are you? What do you want?" Sophie demanded, trying to keep her voice from shaking. Vance took off his hat, brushing a speck of snow from the brim. "I am Elias Vance. I represent the county's interests in derelict properties. And you, Ms. Pendleton, are trespassing on county land." "I inherited this land," Sophie fired back. "You inherited a $42,000 debt," Vance corrected smoothly. "A debt you cannot pay. The grace period ends on Monday, at which point the county seizes the asset." However, Vance smiled, showing too many teeth. "I am a charitable man. I see you are in a tight spot. I am willing to pay off your debt and give you $10,000 cash, right now, to walk away. You sign the deed over to my private LLC, and you and your boy can go start a new life." $10,000. A few hours ago, Sophie would have wept with gratitude at the offer. She would have taken the money and run as fast as she could. But then she remembered the thick concrete walls, the immaculate office, the ledger talking about Project Silver and the Cobalt series. Vance didn't want the land. He didn't want the cabin. He wanted what was buried beneath it. And he wanted it desperately enough to drive out here at dawn. "No," Sophie said. Vance's smile vanished. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Sophie said, her voice finding a sudden, iron strength she didn't know she possessed. "The property is mine until Monday. Get out of my house." The large man took a step forward, raising the crowbar, but Vance held up a hand to stop him. Vance stared at Sophie, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, little girl," Vance whispered. "Arthur Pendleton was a paranoid lunatic who stole things that didn't belong to him. Things that are very valuable to very dangerous people. You cannot hold this land. You have no money. You have no lawyer. By Monday morning, I will own this dirt, and you will be out on the street with nothing. Get out," Sophie repeated, pointing to the shattered door. Vance stared at her for a long, suffocating moment. Then, he put his hat back on. "Monday, Miss Pendleton. Enjoy the freezing cold." He turned and walked out, his muscle following closely behind. Sophie watched through the broken window until their large black truck disappeared down the snow-choked road. As soon as they were gone, Sophie collapsed against the wall, her knees buckling. She was shaking violently, cold sweat slicking her spine. She had just rejected $10,000. She had just made a very dangerous enemy. "Mom," Leo whispered, crawling out of his sleeping bag. "Are we going home?" Sophie looked at her son. She looked at the rotting walls around them. Then, she looked down at the steel trapdoor. "No, baby," Sophie said softly. "We're going downstairs." An hour later, Sophie and Leo were back in the underground office. The air was warm enough that Leo could take off his heavy coat. He sat in Arthur's leather chair, spinning slowly, fascinated by the old rotary phone. Sophie stood before a heavy iron door at the back of the office that she hadn't noticed during her first panicked visit. It was flush with the concrete wall, completely featureless except for a small, four-pronged keyhole in the center. She took the strange brass key she had found under the ledger. Her hand trembled as she slid it into the lock. It fit perfectly. She turned it. Clank, clank, clank. Deep within the wall, heavy tumblers fell into place. Sophie grabbed the handle and pulled. The door was incredibly thick, like the airlock of a submarine. It opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. When Sophie stepped through, the darkness was absolute. But as her foot crossed the threshold, a motion sensor was triggered. High above, a massive array of industrial lights hummed to life. Thrumming with power, they clicked on row by row, illuminating a space so vast it defied logic. Sophie gasped, dropping the flashlight. Her hands flew to her mouth. She was standing on a metal catwalk overlooking an immense, subterranean hangar. The ceiling had to be 40 feet high, supported by massive steel pillars. The air down here was pristine, strictly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of rubber and polished metal. But it wasn't the size of the room that left Sophie paralyzed. It was what was inside it. Arranged in perfect, symmetrical rows, resting on polished concrete, were cars. But they weren't just cars. Directly below her sat a pristine, cherry-red 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO. Next to it was an immaculate, silver 1955 Mercedes-Benz 300 SLR. Behind that, a row of flawless, custom-built Duesenbergs from the 1930s. There were Shelby Cobras, vintage Bugattis, and Aston Martins, their chrome bumpers gleaming under the harsh halogen lights. Dozens of them, all in perfect, showroom condition. Sophie gripped the railing of the catwalk, her mind spinning wildly, trying to process the impossible mathematics of what she was looking at. Uncle Arthur hadn't been a hoarder of junk. He had been a collector, a preserver of history. He had taken his vast, unseen wealth during the Cold War and built a fortress to protect the most beautiful machines ever created from the nuclear annihilation he feared was coming. She slowly descended the metal stairs to the floor of the hangar. She walked among the silent giants, terrified to even touch them. She recognized some of these from magazines she used to clean at the dentist's office. A single one of these cars could be worth millions, and there were at least 30 of them here. At the far end of the hangar, separated by a chain-link fence, was something else. Sophie walked toward it. Inside a locked cage sat 3 heavy wooden crates, stamped with military insignias from the 1940s. One of the crates had been pried open long ago. Sophie looked inside and stopped breathing entirely. Stacked in neat, heavy rows were bars of solid, stamped gold bullion. They were dusty, but the dull, unmistakable gleam of pure gold was undeniable. Resting on top of the bars was a manila envelope. Sophie picked it up. Inside was a letter, written in Arthur's spidery handwriting. "To my blood, if you have found this, you have survived the end of the world." Or, "The world did not end, and I was merely a foolish old man." Either way, the machines are legally acquired. The gold is legally stamped. The titles are in the filing cabinet upstairs. Do not let the vultures take it. Use it to build something that lasts. Sophie fell to her knees. She pressed her face into her hands and let out a sob that echoed through the massive cavern. It was a sob of release, of terror, of overwhelming, crushing relief. She wasn't destitute. She wasn't trapped. She was sitting on a fortune that defied comprehension. But the relief was fleeting. Reality crashed back down on her with the force of an avalanche. The debt, the $42,000 tax lien. If she couldn't pay it by Monday, the county would seize the property. Vance knew what was down here. He would pay the lien, take the land, and claim the vault as abandoned property. She had the wealth of an emperor beneath her feet, but she couldn't use a single piece of it without exposing it to Vance before she owned it free and clear. You can't just walk into a small-town Maine bank with a bar of Nazi-era gold or the keys to an unregistered Ferrari and ask for a loan. They would freeze the assets. They would call the authorities. Vance, who clearly had the local government in his pocket, would swoop in with an injunction and tie the estate up in litigation for decades while she starved. She needed $42,000 in legal, clean cash by Monday morning. And it was already Saturday. Sophie wiped her eyes, her mind racing. She was a single mother who had spent 5 years surviving on scraps, constantly outsmarting eviction notices, rationing food, and making $1 stretch across a week. She knew how to fight. She knew how to hustle. Sophie walked back to the gold crates. She couldn't sell a whole bar. It was too suspicious. But she searched the shelves lining the cage. She found a heavy set of bolt cutters and a metal file. Grunting with effort, Sophie clamped the bolt cutters onto the corner of a gold bar and leaned all her weight onto the handles. The metal, soft and heavy, yielded. A chunk of gold the size of a matchbox fell to the floor. She picked it up, filed off the military stamp until it was just a smooth, irregular nugget of raw gold. "Leo," Sophie called out, running back up to the office. "Put your coat back on. We're going to the city." The drive to Portland took 3 hours. Sophie left the property secured, locking the vault, sealing the hatch, and dragging the frozen rug back over the steel plate. In Portland, away from Vance's sphere of influence, Sophie found a high-end pawn shop and precious metals dealer. The dealer, a skeptical man with a jeweler's loupe, tested the nugget with acid. "It's high purity," he muttered, eyeing her frayed coat and exhausted face. "I can give you 16,000 for the weight. Not a penny more." "I need 20," Sophie said firmly. 16 is the market rate for scrap, lady." "Then I'll find another buyer," Sophie said, reaching for the gold, bluffing with every ounce of her soul. The dealer sighed. 18. Cash. Final offer. Sophie took it. 18,000 was a fortune, but it wasn't 42. She was still short. She walked out into the freezing Portland afternoon, a thick envelope of cash in her pocket, her mind frantic. Where could she get the rest? She couldn't go back and chop up more gold. The dealer would get suspicious and report her. She needed a legitimate loan. She looked across the street and saw a polished, glass-fronted building, Harding and Associates, corporate law. Sophie crossed the street. She walked past the receptionist, ignoring protests, and knocked on the glass door of a senior partner. A woman in a sharp gray suit looked up, annoyed. "Excuse me, you can't be in here," the lawyer said. Sophie walked in, closed the door, and dropped a large file folder on the desk. It was the manifest she had taken from Arthur's office, along with one original title document for a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO. "My name is Sophie Pendleton," Sophie said, her voice steady. "I have just inherited a property in Blackwood County. The estate contains assets conservatively valued at over $50 million. I need a short-term loan of $24,000 to clear a tax lien by Monday morning, or the county seizes it. If you front me the money and represent me against a corrupt local developer named Elias Vance, I will pay you $500,000 by the end of the month." The lawyer, whose nameplate read Sarah Harding, stared at Sophie. She looked at the frayed coat. She looked at the desperate eyes. Then, slowly, she opened the folder. Sarah read the title document. She touched the embossed seal. She looked at the manifest. "This is a title for a car that hasn't been seen in public since 1974, Sarah said quietly. "If this is a forgery, it's a federal crime." "It's not a forgery," Sophie said. "And there are 30 more just like it. I have the keys. I have the location. But Vance knows it's there. He's going to steal it." Sarah leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her desk. She was a shark, and she smelled blood in the water. "Vance. From Sterling, Hayes and Vance. They're bottom feeders. They prey on out-of-state heirs, using local tax laws to seize inherited land. He offered me $10,000 to walk away," Sophie said. Sarah smiled. It was a cold, professional smile. "If Elias Vance offered you $10,000, he knows what's buried there. Which means this is real." Sarah stood up, smoothing her suit. "Ms. Pendleton, I don't give out loans. But I do work on retainer. And my firm has a very aggressive emergency litigation fund. Let's take a ride to Blackwood County." Monday morning, 8 a.m. The freezing wind howled across the desolate clearing as 3 vehicles pulled up to the rotting cabin. First was Vance's black SUV, accompanied by a local sheriff's cruiser. Vance stepped out, wearing a thick fur coat, looking triumphant. He held a clipboard with a county seizure notice. But parked in front of the cabin was Sophie's beat-up sedan. And standing on the sagging porch, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee from a thermos, were Sophie and Sarah Harding. Vance's confident smile faltered as he approached. He didn't recognize Sarah, but he recognized the expensive cut of her coat and the leather briefcase in her hand. "Ms. Pendleton," Vance said, his voice tight. "It is 8 a.m. The grace period has expired. The county is taking possession of this property." "Actually, Mr. Vance," Sarah stepped forward, her voice ringing out clearly in the cold air. "The county won't be doing any such thing. The back taxes on 44 Blackwood Ridge were paid in full by a certified cashier's check at the county clerk's office at 7:05 a.m. this morning. Furthermore, I have filed an emergency injunction in federal court against you, your law firm, and the county, citing predatory foreclosure practices." Vance's face drained of color. He stared at Sarah, then at Sophie. The vein in his neck pulsed. "You don't have the money," he hissed at Sophie, dropping his polite facade. "You're a broke waitstaff nobody." "I was," Sophie said, stepping down from the porch. She looked Vance dead in the eye, the fear that had controlled her life for 5 years entirely gone. Now, I am the sole owner of the Pendleton estate, and you are trespassing. Vance looked at the sheriff, seeking help, but the officer simply held up his hands and stepped back. Taxes are paid, Elias. It's her land. You need to leave. Vance's hands clenched into fists. He looked past Sophie, staring at the rotting wood of the cabin, knowing what lay beneath it. $50 million in history, slipping through his fingers. He took a step towards Sophie, his face twisting into a mask of pure rage. You think you can protect it? Vance spat. You think you can manage what's down there? You're out of your depth, little girl. Maybe, Sophie said softly, but I have a really good lawyer. Now get off my land. Vance stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping his coat. Then, without another word, he turned, got into his SUV, and sped away, throwing a spray of snow and gravel in his wake. Sophie watched him go, letting out a long, shuddering breath. Her legs felt weak. Sarah put a hand on her shoulder. You did good, Sarah said quietly. Now, are you going to show me this bunker? 6 months later, the rotting cabin on Blackwood Ridge was gone. In its place stood a discreet, highly secure, state-of-the-art facility. The excavation and extraction had taken months, handled by a team of specialists bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements. The auction of the Pendleton collection sent shockwaves through the classic car world. The 1962 Ferrari alone sold for $22 million to a private buyer in Geneva. The gold bullion was quietly liquidated through international banking channels, heavily taxed but immensely profitable. In total, the estate was valued at $53 million. Sophie did not buy a mansion. She did not buy a yacht. She bought a massive block of old, abandoned apartment buildings in her old neighborhood back in the city. She gutted them and rebuilt them from the inside out. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when Sophie stood in the lobby of the newly opened Arthur Pendleton Housing Trust. The floors were warm hardwood, the radiators hissed with reliable, steady heat, and the air smelled of fresh paint and pine. The building was dedicated entirely to single mothers facing eviction. Rent was based on income, capped at a fraction of the market rate. There was a free daycare on the first floor and a job placement center on the second. Sophie watched as a young woman with dark bags under her eyes and a toddler on her hip walked through the front doors, carrying a single trash bag of belongings. The woman looked terrified, exhausted, and desperately cold. Sophie remembered that cold. It was a cold that got into your bones and made you believe you were worthless. Sophie walked over to the woman with a warm smile. Hi, Sophie said gently, handing the woman a set of keys. Welcome home. The heat is on, and the fridge is full. The woman stared at the keys, tears welling up in her eyes, spilling over her cheeks as she collapsed into Sophie's arms, sobbing with gratitude. Sophie held her tight, looking out the glass doors at the rainy street. In her pocket, her hand brushed against a small, heavy brass key with 4 prongs. She kept it as a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in the light. Sometimes you have to dig through the rot, face the freezing dark, and break the locks yourself. Leo came running out of the daycare center, laughing, his asthma completely gone, his cheeks flushed with healthy warmth. He grabbed Sophie's hand. Ready to go, Mom? He asked. Sophie smiled. The weight of the world finally lifted from her shoulders. Yeah, baby, she said. Let's go home.